Welcome to our deep dive, and today we're going to be tackling a really interesting question, one that's been sparking debate for decades, actually.
Hmm.
Can traditional values and modern feminism coexist? I mean, it's a big one.
Yeah, a lot to unpack
A
there.
lot to unpack, definitely. You know, our listeners have sent in some fascinating sources for us.
Oh yeah, some really interesting stuff.
We've got academic articles, kind of going through the whole history of
The
feminism.
history is so important to understanding where we are today.
Exactly, yeah. And then we have, some analysis of like societal trends, really thought-provoking stuff. And okay, this is the one I'm really excited about.
Okay.
We're going to be taking a peek into the world of K-pop.
It's not what you'd expect when you think about this topic.
No, not at all. But that's what I love about these deep dives. You never know where we're going to end up, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, so before we jump into like specific examples from these sources, I think it would be helpful to, kind of set the stage. How did we even get to this point in the conversation, around feminism and traditionalism?
Yeah, absolutely. I think starting with a basic understanding of feminism's evolution is really key here.
Yeah.
A lot of people are familiar with that kind of waves analogy. You've got
Yeah.
the first wave fighting for those basic rights like suffrage, and then the second wave,
Expanding to more social and cultural sphere.
exactly,
Hmm.
and so on. But I think where things get really interesting and where the debate really starts to heat up is with contemporary feminism. So that's like the third and fourth waves.
And that's where the critics come in, right?
Exactly. I mean, while I think pretty much everyone can agree that feminism has achieved significant progress, there's this growing sense that maybe.
Maybe the movement needs to address some of its, kind of internal
I
contradictions,
exactly.
because even those who like fundamentally support feminist principles
Right.
are starting to kind of raise questions.
Yeah, you're seeing criticisms coming from both the right and the left.
Oh,
Questioning the effectiveness of intersectionality, for example.
oh, okay. So let's talk about that for a second, because I feel like intersectionality has become kind of a buzzword.
It has. It's almost lost its meaning.
It has. And I think for a lot of people, they're like, wait, isn't it a good thing to acknowledge, the different experiences of women based on their race, their class, their sexual orientation, all these other factors?
You would think, yeah.
So where are the critics saying it falls short?
Well, one of the main criticisms, and you see this from, both sides of the political spectrum, is this idea that
Okay.
focusing solely on identity can actually overshadow the commonalities that unite us.
Okay, that's interesting.
So, for example, take the issue of economic inequality.
Right.
It affects women across all demographics,
Of course. Yeah.
but it affects them in different ways.
Right. Right.
And so the critics are saying, well, by emphasizing the differences, are we actually overlooking the potential for solidarity?
So instead of kind of coming together to fight for, like common goals,
Yeah.
we're getting kind of bogged down in these like,
These individual grievances,
yes.
and that's preventing collective action.
Okay. I see what you're saying.
That's a really valid point.
It is. So it's like we're saying, okay, acknowledging individual experiences is crucial. We get that. But then we also need to find ways to like bridge those differences and actually work towards.
Shared goals.
Yeah. But are those two ideas like fundamentally at odds with each other?
It's the million-dollar question, right?
How do we reconcile that?
There's no easy answer, and I think that's what's so interesting about these criticisms,
Yeah,
that they're forcing us to grapple with these really complex issues.
totally. Yeah.
But I think one approach could be, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, is maybe shifting the focus,
Okay.
you know, less from individual grievances and more towards collective solutions.
Okay. I like that.
So, for instance, instead of constantly framing the conversation around what do women want, maybe we start asking, what kind of society do we want to create?
Okay, so focusing on like a shared vision of the future
That'd be great.
instead of.
Instead of getting bogged down in all
Yeah.
of these different,
Right. Right.
specific wants.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then I think another point that the critics bring up, and I think this is an important one, is that contemporary feminism often seems to be too focused on the experiences of, like Western middle class women.
Mhm.
So how do we ensure that the movement is truly like global and inclusive? How do we bring in the voices of women from all different backgrounds, all different cultures?
That's where I think the conversation needs to expand beyond just academic circles.
Totally.
It can't just be happening in universities and in these kind of, elite spaces.
Ivory towers. Yeah.
It needs to be engaging with grassroots movements
Yeah.
led by women from diverse backgrounds.
Yeah.
Feminism can't be this top-down movement, dictated by a select few.
Right.
It has to reflect the lived realities of women in all their complexity and diversity.
So it's really about like amplifying the voices and experiences of women who have been historically marginalized
Hmm.
and making sure that their perspectives are shaping the agenda, right?
Absolutely. And you know what? That actually brings us to another crucial aspect of this whole conversation,
Okay.
which is the changing landscape of masculinity.
Okay, now we're talking.
Because if gender roles are shifting, as, feminist movements advocate,
Right.
then how has that impacted what it means to, quote unquote, be a man in today's world?
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up because, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you have this kind of, traditional view of masculinity.
Right, like that archetype.
The archetype, yeah.
Hmm.
Strength, stoicism, being the provider, all that.
Right.
But clearly that's being challenged.
Oh, absolutely.
So what are some of the alternative models of masculinity that are emerging?
Well, that's where the concept of multiple masculinities comes into play.
Multiple masculinities, okay.
Yeah. And it acknowledges that there is no one-size-fits-all definition of manhood, right?
Right.
What's considered masculine can vary greatly depending on cultural context, the historical period,
Oh, interesting.
individual experiences.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. So give me some examples, like how has masculinity been expressed throughout history?
Okay, well, consider the gentleman ideal
Yeah.
that was prevalent in 18th century Europe.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So this model of masculinity emphasized things like politeness, refinement, intellectual pursuits,
So it's still a very hierarchical kind of
social order.
social order.
It was still upholding the existing power structures, for sure.
But it wasn't just about like brute strength or
Right.
physical dominance.
It was about your intellect, your, social prowess.
Yeah, interesting.
And then, fast forward a couple of centuries, and you have examples like the metrosexual
Oh, you're
of
right.
the late 20th, early 21st century, and they embrace fashion, grooming.
This is like the David Beckham era, right?
Exactly. Yeah, this idea that men should care about their appearance.
Right, a more refined aesthetic sensibility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you can see how these different expressions of masculinity
Yeah.
have challenged that traditional archetype.
So it's like masculinity is becoming more fluid, more multifaceted.
I think that's a great way to put it.
But how does this evolution of masculinity like tie back into our conversation about feminism? Are they happening like in parallel or are they, directly influencing each other?
I think it's definitely a two-way street.
Okay.
As women challenge traditional gender roles and expectations,
Right.
men are also being forced to reevaluate their own identities
Totally. Yeah.
and how they navigate the world.
So it's like a dance
I love that analogy.
where both partners are like constantly adapting and influencing each other's movements.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image.
Okay. So we've been talking a lot about like, gender roles, expectations, all of that. But we can't ignore the biological realities of being male and female, right? Like, what does science tell us about the inherent differences and similarities between the sexes?
That's a crucial part of this discussion because, while societal and cultural factors undoubtedly shape our understanding of gender, biology also plays a significant role.
Of course, yeah.
And one of the most hotly debated areas is the question of intelligence.
Oh, okay, let's get into that.
Okay.
Because I've definitely heard, arguments that men and women are just like inherently different when it comes to cognitive ability. So like, what does the research actually say about that?
So the research consistently shows that there's no significant difference in average intelligence between men and women.
Okay.
However, and this is where things get a little more complicated, men tend to have a wider range of scores on intelligence tests.
What does that mean?
So you're more likely to find like geniuses
Okay.
among men,
Okay.
but also more men at the, lower end of the spectrum.
Right. Okay. So more men are geniuses, but also more men are, well, not geniuses.
You could say that.
That's interesting.
Right. And this finding has sparked a lot of debate about the implications, for things like gender disparities in certain fields.
Right. Like we see in STEM.
Exactly.
Yeah, where men continue to be overrepresented.
Hmm. But it's important to remember we're talking about averages here, not individuals.
Right. Right. So we can't make like sweeping generalizations
Exactly.
about
See,
entire groups.
based on statistical trends.
Yeah, totally.
It's just one piece of the puzzle.
Okay. So even if men and women have like similar average intelligence, you can't deny that there are like physical differences between the sexes.
Oh, absolutely. On average, men tend to have greater upper body strength.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right, from an evolutionary perspective.
Absolutely.
Their historical roles in hunting and protection.
It all kind of ties together.
But I think what's interesting is that even those physical differences can be influenced by, like environmental factors, things like nutrition and training. So it's not like completely predetermined, right?
It's not just about the blueprint. It's also about the environment that you're in,
Yeah.
the choices that you make.
Yeah, totally.
And, perhaps the most fascinating area of difference between the sexes
Okay, hit me with it.
lies not in personality traits, but in interests.
Oh.
Research has shown that on average, men are more drawn to things and ideas,
Okay.
and women are more interested in people and feelings.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is.
And, this could shed light on why we see those gender disparities in certain fields, like you mentioned, STEM,
Right.
which tends to be more, object-focused,
Yeah, yeah.
and then caregiving, which is inherently people-oriented.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
So this innate difference in interests, coupled with societal expectations, can lead to, like, self-selection.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
But again, we have to emphasize that these are general trends,
Yeah.
not absolutes.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
There are plenty of women who are brilliant engineers
Of course, yeah.
and men who are compassionate caregivers.
Totally, yeah. It's like the whole nature versus nurture debate, right?
Always.
Both biology and environment,
It's a complex interplay.
shaping who we are and what we're drawn to. But here's what I'm curious about.
Right.
If these inherent differences in interests exist,
Mm-hmm.
how does that impact the dynamics of relationships?
Oh.
And the so-called sexual marketplace,
Right, because if men and women are wired differently, doesn't that inevitably lead to, tension and conflict when it comes to choosing partners?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
That's a great question, and it brings us to another crucial aspect of this conversation,
Okay, let's hear it.
which is understanding the complexities of the sexual marketplace
Okay.
and how it's been impacted by both feminist movements and shifting societal norms.
Okay, so first of all, for anyone who might not be familiar with this term, what exactly is the sexual marketplace?
Right, it's not something you hear every day.
Not really, no.
So the sexual marketplace is essentially just a framework for understanding how men and women interact and choose partners.
Okay.
It's based on the principles of supply and demand, much like any other market, right?
Right.
Where individuals bring their own assets to the table. We call that, mate value in evolutionary psychology.
Here's your value. Okay.
Yeah, what's fascinating is that there's been a noticeable shift in recent decades, from a focus on resource value to aesthetic value.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So it's not just about financial stability or social status anymore.
Okay.
Physical attractiveness has become a key currency in this market.
So it's like the dating game has become even more competitive?
Oh, absolutely.
And looks are the new status symbol.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't even know.
It's a complex question, and I don't think there are any easy answers, right?
Right.
But it definitely creates challenges, especially for men who feel disadvantaged in this new landscape,
Okay, I can see that, yeah.
where those traditional markers of masculinity, like providing and protecting,
They don't hold the same weight.
they're not as highly valued anymore.
And I could see how that would lead to a sense of frustration, resentment,
Absolutely. And it has, you see this reflected in the rise of online communities like MGTOW.
MGTOW, what is that?
So it stands for Men Going Their Own Way.
Okay.
And it's this whole movement that advocates for men to withdraw from traditional relationships altogether
Wow.
and focus on, their own self-improvement and fulfillment.
It's like a pretty stark response.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
It shows you just how much tension and uncertainty there is around,
Yeah.
gender roles and expectations
Yeah, absolutely.
these days. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the Western perspective, but I'm really excited to kind of shift gears here
Me too.
because you brought some really fascinating material on K-pop. K-pop, yeah.
Yeah.
This global phenomenon that offers a unique lens, for viewing these issues of gender and identity, but from a very different cultural context.
Okay, so before we, get too deep into the world of K-pop, which we will,
We will. It's going to go.
Let's just pause here for a sec and just, acknowledge how much ground we've covered already. Like, we've gone from the history of feminism to the science of gender differences
To the sexual marketplace.
to the sexual marketplace. It's a lot.
It's a lot to process, I know.
But if we take a step back, I feel like there's a common thread running through all of these seemingly like disparate topics.
What do you think it is?
I think it all comes back to this question of how we as individuals
Yeah.
navigate a world where like traditional values are being challenged
Right.
by evolving social norms and this growing awareness of, the complexities of gender and identity.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Right. Yeah.
Between our innate differences and our shared humanity.
Yeah, I like that. It's not about like erasing our differences.
Right.
We're recognizing that, we're all part of this.
We're all human at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this conversation so important, so relevant, for your listeners.
Right.
Because it's not about taking sides in this like never-ending debate.
Yeah.
It's about using these insights to navigate your own personal journey.
To create a more like fulfilling and meaningful life.
Exactly.
I love that. Okay, so I think that's a perfect segue into the next part of our conversation where we'll actually delve into that world of K-pop
Yes.
and see what insights it can offer.
Right. It's going to be fascinating.
I'm so excited about this. So stay tuned, everyone.
Can't wait. Okay, so K-pop. Are you ready to dive into this world?
I'm ready. Let's do it. It's funny. I was thinking about it before we started recording, and I was like, what can a music genre really tell us about, like, feminism and traditionalism? But then I started doing a little bit of reading.
It's so much more than just music, right?
Yeah, it's a whole cultural phenomenon.
It really is. It both reflects and shapes, ideas about gender, beauty, success, all of that. And it's gone global. I mean, you can't deny the impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you mentioned earlier that K-pop offers this unique blend of, like, hyperfemininity and androgyny.
Right.
Can you unpack that a little bit? Because in Western pop culture, at least from my perspective, those two concepts often seem to be at odds with each other.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes K-pop so intriguing. It challenges these very Western binaries.
Okay.
So, for example, you have female K-pop groups like, Blackpink. They project this fierce, independent image. Their vocals are incredible. The fashion is super edgy.
It's powerful.
It is, and it really
Yeah.
resonates with the whole, empowerment themes that we often find in, Western feminism.
Right. So they kind of embody, at least on the surface, certain aspects of what we consider, feminist ideals.
Feminist ideals.
But then you have the androgyny aspect, right? And that feels like a whole different direction.
It does, and this is where it gets complex, I think.
Yeah.
Because K-pop, it really blurs the lines.
Okay.
You see male groups like BTS incorporating makeup, fashion, dance styles that had traditionally been associated with femininity in the West, in Western cultures.
Right.
And it challenges this idea that men need to conform to this, very narrow definition of masculinity.
Okay, so it's like they're taking elements from both ends of the spectrum and creating something totally new. But does that blurring of gender lines actually challenge traditional gender roles? Or does it just
Sure.
create like a new set of expectations?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
I mean, some people argue that K-pop actually reinforces traditional beauty standards, especially with the prevalence of plastic surgery in South Korea.
Oh, right.
It's a huge industry there, and it really speaks to this pressure to conform to this very specific ideal.
So it's like, on the one hand, they're pushing boundaries with gender expression, but on the other hand, they're still operating within this system that, places a high value on physical perfection.
And that's the paradox, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit contradictory.
Yeah, and I think it really highlights just how complex these issues are,
Totally.
Because while K-pop might be challenging some aspects of traditional gender roles, it's also reinforcing others.
Right, and I think it just goes to show how these conversations are, like, evolving globally. Different cultures are grappling with these ideas in their own unique ways.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about societal expectations, these external pressures, right?
Right.
But at the end of the day, like, how do we as individuals, navigate this really complex landscape
Yes.
of gender roles, societal expectations, but also our own personal values?
Because it's so easy to get caught up in, like, the external noise.
Absolutely. It's everywhere you look these days.
But we need to, like, find a way to live authentically.
And I think that's where the concept of virtue ethics comes in.
Virtue ethics, okay.
Yes, this philosophical framework that I think transcends like the specific debates about feminism or traditionalism,
Okay.
and instead focuses on cultivating those character traits that are beneficial for like both individuals and society as a whole.
You mentioned virtue ethics a little bit earlier. Can you just remind us, like, what does that actually entail?
Yeah, so virtue ethics, as discussed by, philosophers like Aristotle, emphasizes traits like prudence, justice, courage, temperance.
Okay.
These are qualities that empower us to make good choices, act ethically, live meaningful lives.
So it's about, like, striving to be a good person, regardless of your, like, gender identity or societal expectations.
Yeah, it's about developing those inner qualities that guide us towards a life of, purpose and fulfillment.
I love that.
And what's so fascinating about this is that I actually think this concept of virtue ethics can bridge the gap between, seemingly opposing ideologies like feminism and traditionalism.
Wait, really?
Yeah, I do. I really do.
I mean, because on the surface, it seems like they're coming from such different perspective.
They do seem that way, I know.
Yeah.
But think about it this way. Feminism, at its core, is about empowering individuals to live authentically, reach their full potential regardless of gender.
Right. Yeah.
And traditionalism, when you kind of strip away some of the more problematic aspects,
Yeah.
it emphasizes values and principles that can guide individuals towards a life of meaning and purpose.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily about choosing one side or the other.
Right.
It's about recognizing that both perspectives have something valuable to offer.
I see. So it's about finding, like, that sweet spot where, individual empowerment and timeless values intersect.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how, like, virtue ethics could be that common ground.
Yeah, it's that foundation, that bedrock.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. But then how do we actually cultivate these virtues? Like, is it something we're born with, or is it something we can, like, learn and develop over time?
That's a great question. And Aristotle believed that virtue is something that we develop through practice and habit.
Okay.
So it's about making conscious choices that align with our values, even when it's difficult.
So it's not always easy,
Oh, no, definitely not.
but it's about, like, constantly striving.
Striving to be better,
Yeah.
not just for ourselves, but for like the world around us.
It's an ongoing process of, like, self-reflection, growth, making choices that are,
aligned with our values, with our deepest values.
yeah. And it's about, becoming the best version of ourselves,
Absolutely.
regardless of those external pressures or societal expectations.
And that's something that we can all aspire to, regardless of our gender, our beliefs, where we come from.
Right. I love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We really have.
We've talked about the evolution of feminism, the changing landscape of masculinity,
The sexual marketplace.
the complexities of the sexual marketplace. We took a detour into the world of K-pop.
So much good stuff.
It's a lot, but what's the key takeaway for our listeners? Like, what's the one thing we want them to walk away with?
I think the most important message is this. The world is changing. Gender roles are evolving. And there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this question of, like, how to navigate all of this complexity.
Yeah.
But by embracing the pursuit of knowledge, self-improvement, excellence,
Yes.
you can create a life that is both meaningful and fulfilling, regardless of your gender, your beliefs, where you come from.
That's, like, such a powerful message
Yeah.
of hope and empowerment. But before we wrap up completely, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about traditionalism, having something valuable to offer. Because I think for some people, that might feel a little bit controversial. Can you just, like, elaborate on what you meant by that?
Yeah, of course. When I talk about traditionalism, I'm not referring to, those rigid, often oppressive structures that have historically, limited individual freedom and expression, especially for women.
Right.
What I'm referring to are the core values that many traditions have upheld. Things like, community, family, respect for elders,
Okay.
a sense of purpose that goes beyond just like individual gratification.
So it's about, like, discerning the values that can actually enrich our lives from the outdated structures
Yeah, exactly.
that need to be dismantled.
And I think that's so important to remember that, you can take the wisdom of the past and integrate it into a modern framework
Totally.
that values individual autonomy, recognizes the complexity
Yeah.
of the human experience.
Okay, so it's not about, like, throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
No, exactly. It's about being discerning and thoughtful
Right.
rather than resorting to, knee-jerk reactions.
And that kind of brings us back to the importance of critical thinking, right? Which is
Mhm.
something we've been emphasizing this entire time.
Throughout the whole deep dive.
It's about questioning assumptions, considering different perspectives,
Mhm.
and forming our own conclusions.
Based on that careful consideration.
Yes, exactly. Okay, well, I think this has been such an insightful conversation. I know I've learned a lot. I hope our listeners have too.
Me too. It's been a pleasure chatting with you about all this.
Likewise.
Right.
What, final thoughts would you like to leave our listeners with?
It's interesting. We started this deep dive with the question of whether traditional values and modern feminism can coexist, right?
We did.
And after exploring all of these different sources, the different viewpoints, I think the answer is a resounding yes.
Okay.
But it's not about finding this perfect compromise or, forcing these seemingly opposing ideologies into a neat little box.
Right.
It's about embracing the messiness, the contradictions, and the ongoing evolution of how we understand ourselves, each other, and the world around us.
Yeah, I love that. It's about embracing the journey
A journey.
and being open to the possibilities, right?
Exactly. And that journey, I believe, is what makes life so fascinating and ultimately fulfilling.
I couldn't agree more. Well, on that note, I want to thank you again for, guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for taking this journey with us. We hope you found it thought-provoking and empowering. As we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm struck by how much we've actually covered.
It's been a lot.
We've tackled some pretty dense topics. The history and evolution of feminism, the science behind gender differences, the dynamics of the sexual marketplace, even K-pop's influence on global culture.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. But what I find so fascinating is that, it all kind of circles back to this idea of individual empowerment.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
At its core, this exploration of feminism and traditionalism and everything in between,
Right.
it's really about helping you, the listener,
Right.
understand your place in the world.
Yes.
And it's
Yeah.
not about dictating what that place should be, right?
Right.
It's about giving you the tools to actually define it for yourself.
Exactly. It's like we've been assembling this toolkit, right?
I like that. A toolkit.
Filled with all these different lenses through which to view the world. And now it's up to you, our listener, to take those tools and apply them to your own life.
And what's so cool is that this toolkit isn't static, right?
Right.
It's constantly evolving
Yeah.
as you gain new knowledge, new experience.
Yeah, and to be honest, that's what I love most about these deep dives.
Mhm.
It's not about finding all the answers.
No.
It's about embracing the journey of exploration and discovery.
100%.
Yeah.
I think that's a key takeaway. For anyone listening,
Oh, what is it?
don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions.
Mm.
Engage with ideas that maybe make you a little bit uncomfortable.
Right.
And be open to changing your mind.
Because that's where growth comes from, right?
Absolutely.
Stepping outside of our comfort zones and being willing to see the world from different angles.
100%.
Yeah.
And, as you continue on this journey, just remember that you're not alone.
Yeah.
We're all kind of navigating these complexities together,
You are.
each in our own way.
It's like we're all on this grand adventure of figuring out what it means to be human in the 21st century, right?
Yeah, with all its complexities and contradictions. But that's what makes it so exciting.
I couldn't agree more.
Right.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you again for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
Your insights have been just invaluable.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
And to you, our listener, thank you for taking this journey with us.
Yeah, we hope you found it.
We hope it's been thought-provoking, empowering.
And remember,
Yes.
the most important questions are often the ones that don't have easy answers.
So keep exploring
Keep questioning.
and keep striving to be the best version of yourself.
Until next time.
See you then.